Alice and I are always looking to be more healthy, and we were just talking about how fasting is one of the best ways to do that, but it's so hard. But the great thing about Prolon is that's not what you're doing. It's not that you're not eating for 5 days. Instead, you're using their science-backed program to convince your body you're fasting.
You guys, this 5-day program really is amazing. It comes beautifully packaged and it does all the thinking for you. Each day is its own box. And by following their program, I know I just feel so much better. And I can't wait to experience Prolon Next Gen and continue to see results. For a limited time, you can be first in line to experience the new Next Gen at special savings. Prolon is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off site-wide plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's PROLONLIFE.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors.
Hey guys. Have you ever wanted to hear the story behind some of the most compelling hauntings in history? From Amityville to The Conjuring, the Grave Talks podcast takes you there. You guys know how much we love the supernatural, and 3 times a week, Tony Bruschi, host of the Grave Talks, talks to the people who experienced shocking paranormal phenomena firsthand. He dives into how the experience affected those who survived it and how it made them who they are today. He answers questions like, what really happened to the Perron family inside their haunted farmhouse? What was it like investigating side by side with Ed and Lorraine Warren as they stepped foot inside the infamous Amityville house? Hear supernatural stories that you will not find anywhere else on The Grave Talks. Search The Grave Talks wherever you download podcasts and press subscribe. Then start binging away on the ghost stories no one ever thought would be told. That is The Grave Talks. Search for it wherever you download podcasts. I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors. Over a period of decades, Bill Cosby allegedly drugged and sexually assaulted as many as 60 women. So why was his conviction overturned? And what in the world is going on with Britney Spears? Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my cosmogyral co-host, Alice.
I have no idea what you just said.
I don't really know what it means, but Sophie suggested that one. It means like celestial or something.
I love it. Let me be clear. Before we started recording, both of us have just been tripping over our words all night. So I didn't know if that was a real there you go. A real word, or you are tripping over your words like I am right now.
Yeah, this one could be an interesting one, guys. We're both working on very little sleep here.
But for very happy reasons for you.
Yes. Well, for both of us, you're employed, which is good. And I was able to bring our baby home. So he is now home with us, which is fantastic. It's kind of funny. We've already recorded some episodes where he wasn't home, so don't get confused by that. We have brought him home, and we're doing the whole up every couple hours thing now. So, but it's wonderful. It's a great kind of tired.
Thanks for sharing as you go along the journey. But I'm so glad he's home. I'm so glad you're getting somewhat little sleep. That's good news.
I know. Me too. You know, he had a 24-hour concierge in the NICU, but we're much happier to have him here with us. And thank you to everybody. All your prayers, they meant a lot to us. And, he's here, so prayers are answered, and we're just so happy to have him. And yeah, I was going to keep you guys up to date. You guys are all family. We're all one big family now. We've been through a lot together, so we're forged in fire, as it were. But hey, we're back to talking true crime, and we have something a little different. Normally we're doing murder and mayhem. The things we're going to talk about today are just as bad in some ways, but we're moving away from the murder and mayhem and into something that's in the news very recently, just a few days ago, as a matter of fact. Bill Cosby's conviction was overturned. He had been convicted on some rape counts in Pennsylvania, as most of you know, and his case went all the way to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, and the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania overturned his conviction. And there's a lot of people who are really confused by that and don't really understand why it happened. So we thought this was an interesting case to go through. And then on the same day, something else happened that has confused a lot of people, and a lot of people have had questions about. Britney Spears, who is currently in a struggle about a conservatorship that she's under in California, had her request to be released from that conservatorship denied. So there were a lot of memes that went around saying something along the lines of, we said free Britney, not free Cosby, but what are you going to do? But we're going to talk about both today. We're going to spend most of our time, I think, on Cosby, and then we'll cover Britney a little bit at the end with the caveat that we are not experts in that area of the law, and it's very confusing, but we will give you some sort of overview so you understand a little bit of what's going on in that. But starting with Bill Cosby. Alice, I don't know if you were too young for this, but when I was growing up, the Bill Cosby show, The Cosby Show, was huge.
Oh no, Brett, it was amazing, and I watched it, I think, like on Nick at Night reruns, not in real time, but absolutely, I grew up watching Bill Cosby. It was still huge decades later.
People talked about Bill Cosby as America's dad. It was sort of a breakthrough show in a lot of ways because you had this African-American family sitcom, and you just didn't have a lot of that on television before the Bill Cosby Show came along, and a lot of us grew up. Bill Cosby was the guy on the Jell-O commercials, and he was this sort of very, like I said, fatherly figure. And then it turns out, we learned later on, just a shocking twist, at least for me, like I said, having grown up watching him, that he was engaged in a lot of really terrible behavior, and that essentially over a period of decades, he had been assaulting these women. And look, I think this episode is different from what we normally do. In my mind, there's not a lot of question about whether or not Bill Cosby is guilty or innocent of these crimes. I think he is pretty clearly guilty. But as we've said before, just because someone is guilty doesn't mean their conviction will stand. And just because someone's conviction is overturned doesn't mean they are innocent. Now, Cosby has maintained his innocence from the beginning, and when his conviction was overturned, he proclaimed it from the rooftops as a vindication of his innocence. And one reason we wanted to cover this is to answer a question: is it a vindication of his innocence? Is this about whether or not Bill Cosby committed this crime? And I think when you look at this, you're going to see that the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania's decision had very little to do with innocence. So we aren't going to spend a whole lot of time on the actual criminal conviction in this case or the underlying facts. Most people, those facts, and it's a tale as old as time. According to the 60 or so women who accused Cosby, and when the number of accusations against you is so many that it's hard to nail down the exact number of how many people have accused you of sexual assault, that's usually a problem. Cosby would invite them to his room under some pretext. Remember, Cosby was a very important person, the kind of person who could make your career if you're in entertainment. He would invite them to his room. He would give them some pills. They would either lose consciousness or lose control over their bodies. And at that point, Cosby would sexually assault them. Now, Cosby's conviction resulted primarily from a 2002 encounter. ABC News and the Associated Press have a great timeline of this case, so we are going to go from what they have told us. We will post those articles on the website if you want to check them out. And we will also be using the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania and its description of some of the facts. So, in your mind, imagine some quotation marks and some little footnotes citing to all this stuff, because those are the sources we will be using.
We'll post these on our website, go to them, but just know that our timeline, it's really just to give you a basis of understanding the overturning of the conviction later. But know that this is coming from that ABC report and the Supreme Court decision. So let's dive in so we're all starting out on the same foot in terms of background. So in 2002, Cosby meets Andrea Constand at Philadelphia's Temple University, which was his alma mater. And that's where she manages the women's basketball team, and he serves as a celebrity booster and trustee of the team. Now, over the course of the next few years, Constand and Cosby interact several times. She's interested beyond just this career in managing the women's basketball team at the university. She's actually interested in a career in sports broadcasting. And Cosby, just because of, his media presence, he offers to help her reach that goal. During the course of several meetings, Cosby makes sexual advances towards Constand. She rebuffs each of them, and he stops. So he would reach over, touch her leg, and she would, kind of brush it off, and he wouldn't pursue it any further. But this happened more than once. Constand was asked, why did she keep interacting with Cosby if he was making kind of these romantic advances towards her and she did not want them to happen? She did not pursue them. She said something that I think maybe a lot of women who are looking for powerful mentors, people who are senior to them in the industry and senior in age have said, which is that she considered him a mentor. She needed his help. He was a very important person. And she said that she was grateful for the advice and help that he'd given her. And that even though he had made some of these advances towards her, she never felt threatened because as soon as, she kind of put things to an end, she would brush him off. He'd always just take no for an answer and he wouldn't go any further than that.
And I think that's an important point that you make about sort of the reality that a lot of women face and have faced over the last, forever. And sort of the whole reason the Me Too movement got started, I think for a lot of women in a lot of careers, if they shut down every man who ever made an unwanted advance towards them, there would be no men left in the industry they were in that they could actually seek advice from or have as a mentor. Unfortunately, I think this was so common and frankly is still so common that I don't think the criticism that people level at some of these women how could you keep talking to him after he made those advances you didn't want? I don't think she felt like she had a choice. I think she felt like if she was going to be in this industry, she just had to endure this, which is one of the big problems here that a lot of people have identified. And when people try and turn it on its head and almost she knew what she was getting into, she got what she deserved. I mean, that's a big problem.
Absolutely. And we're not just talking about someone who's made it in the media industry. We're talking about Bill Cosby, a household name. I think even now, not just because of the lawsuit, decades later, people know his name, and it is one of the most famous names around. You may even think that people won't believe you over someone so famous. I mean, you're absolutely right. This happens in every industry, not just media. It happens in the law, unfortunately. I think it happens to both men and women. It can happen, but it often happens to women. I mean, I will say, law is obviously a male-dominated industry. Yes, the creepy old men who have made me feel uncomfortable, a dime a dozen through the course of going through college, law school, and then starting out my career. You don't always want to make a big deal of it because you don't want to be pegged as the one who is making accusations all the time so that people don't want to work with you. This isn't excusing it, it's just giving you some background.
So in 2004, things take a dramatic change. In January of that year, Constand visits Cosby in Philadelphia. Cosby insists that she enjoy some wine, and despite her repeated refusals, she eventually gives in to his persistence. Now, at some point, she goes to the bathroom because she's not feeling great. And I will always wonder if there was anything other than wine in that wine glass. And when she returns, Cosby offers her 3 blue pills that he tells her will take the edge off. She takes them, and Andrea soon realizes something is very wrong. She has double vision. She can't stand or think clearly. Cosby takes her to another room where she loses consciousness, and when she comes to, she can't move. She does wake up, and Cosby is actually behind her at this point with one hand on her breast and another in her pants. She passes out, and when she wakes up much later, her pants are unzipped and her bra is out of place. The defense would later say that any sexual encounter between the two was consensual and actually happened earlier. And the timing of this is important because Cosby was charged only a few days before the statute of limitations was set to kick in. Cosby has said he gave her the 3 blue pills. He does not deny that to alleviate stress before lying on the couch with her and engaging in what he described as consensual sexual acts. Cosby at the time was 66 and Andrea was 30.
And really quick, I think you said something important there that may need just a little bit of explanation. You said that Cosby was charged only a few days before the statute of limitations. You may have heard that in the news a lot. A statute of limitations just means that there's some limit to the amount of time that has passed for which you can be charged with it. So for most crimes, and it's set by the law, by statute, there's going to be some time limit. Basically, if you don't get caught and you don't get charged within that time period, that's it. You kind of get away with it, right? And so it could be anything that the statute wants. 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. It just depends. And so the reason this matters here is even if you have done something and the government could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you have broken the law, if you are charged outside of the statute of limitations, the law says that that charge cannot be brought.
Right. Famously, murder has no statute of limitations.
But not the case here with sexual assault in Philadelphia. And in most places, I think. I'm trying to think. I think only sexual assault on a child that is later discovered. There's states that allow that.
And a lot of states have changed their laws recently to address this very problem, particularly in the wake of the Me Too movement and a lot of the stories that came out about these decades-old sexual assaults by a lot of very powerful people. A lot of states have actually pushed back their statute of limitations. Probably a good thing. I mean, statutes of limitations do exist for a reason. Memories fade, evidence goes stale. There's just a fear that after a certain period of time, if you try and convict someone, there's a greater danger of wrongful conviction, for instance. So that's sort of the reason they exist, but a lot of people think they've been much too short for a lot of these crimes.
Now let's jump forward to 2005. In January, Constant now is back home in suburban Toronto. This is, as you may now remember, a year after the alleged sexual assault by Cosby. She's home and she tells her mom that something happened with Cosby. In fact, she tells her mom that she's been sexually assaulted, and the two of them go to the police. Now, the police there suggest that they actually record Cosby on a phone call talking about this sexual encounter. They do call him, and on that call, Cosby does say that he engaged in, quote, digital penetration, but refuses to say what pills he gave her. It's an interesting call because Constance's on the phone, but also her mother is on the phone. And Cosby kind of dances around the pills that he gives her. He says, I'll look it up. I'll tell you later. But he never does actually tell them what the pills were that he gave her. This case is referred to the Pennsylvania authorities. In February, Montgomery County District Attorney Bruce Castor announces that he will not charge Cosby. And that's because he considers this to be a weak case, citing the year-long delay, Constance's continued contact with Cosby, and the failure of other accusers now coming forward to have ever filed a complaint with the police. This is a critical decision, and it has been criticized by a lot of people. But to some extent, Castor was simply reciting what he knew any defense attorney would hammer on at trial. And it's because we all know this too well. Sexual assault cases are really hard to win, even in the best of cases. Here, in Constance's case, there's no physical evidence because it's been a year. A rape kit doesn't really work here, not after there's been an entire year that has passed. She's given several different interviews to police. Remember, we've talked about in past episodes about impeaching a witness on the stand. Because of her differing interviews and stories she's told, she will not be a particularly strong witness on the stand because there will be so much fodder for cross-examination and for impeachment by the defense. And this is because she does have inconsistencies. Now, Castor learned that Constand had contacted civil attorneys, and Castor says that he decided the hill he had to climb was too steep in terms of a criminal conviction. Later, he would state, quote, "There was insufficient credible and admissible evidence upon which any charge against Cosby related to the Constand incident could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt."
And he has gotten a lot of criticism for this, and I think a lot of that criticism is probably justifiable. It is a tough situation, though, and you can imagine the unspoken thing that's probably going on here. He probably was a little afraid, too. I bet he was scared to take on Cosby. He didn't want to take on Cosby unless he had a perfect case. He didn't think he had a perfect case, and so he sort of came up with some excuses. Really, maybe the typical excuses people use when they don't want to prosecute these kind of cases to push it off. Interestingly, though, the fact that he didn't prosecute it doesn't mean that he didn't believe Andrea and didn't want her to get some kind of justice, and so he formed a plan. Now, this is pretty interesting. When someone is sued civilly, they are subject to something called a deposition. And essentially that is a meeting where you have lawyers. They're allowed to ask any questions they want to ask of the person being deposed. The deposition can last upwards of about 7 hours, and the person is required to answer any questions they are asked unless they impinge upon certain privileges. The attorney-client privilege is one of them, and another one is the right against self-incrimination in a criminal trial. So, if you're being deposed in a civil case and you get asked a question that if you answered it, it could incriminate you, you can actually take the Fifth Amendment there and refuse to answer that question. But you cannot claim Fifth Amendment protection if you have immunity from prosecution. And here's what Castor said about all this. Quote, "The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution states that a person may not be compelled to give evidence against themselves. So you can't subpoena somebody and make them testify that they did something illegal, or evidence that would lead someone to conclude that they did something illegal on the threat of, if you don't answer, you'll be subject to sanctions because you're under subpoena." So that's an important part of this. You're under subpoena, you're under oath, you're required to answer, and if you don't answer, you can be held in contempt of court. So the way you remove that from a witness is, if you want to, and what I did in this case, is I made the decision as the sovereign that Mr. Cosby would not be prosecuted no matter what. As a matter of law, that then made it so that he could not take the Fifth Amendment ever as a matter of law. So I've heard banter in the courtroom and in the press about the term agreement, but everybody has used the wrong word. I told Cosby's attorneys that I had decided that because of defects in the case, that the case could not be won, that I was going to make a public statement that we were not going to charge Mr. Cosby. I told him that I was making it as the sovereign of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and in my legal opinion, that meant that Mr. Cosby would not be allowed to take the Fifth Amendment in the subsequent civil suit that Andrea Constand's lawyers had told us they wanted to bring. Phillips agreed with me, that's Cosby's lawyer, that is in fact the law of Pennsylvania and of the United States, and agreed that if Cosby was subpoenaed, he would be required to testify. Now, these are his own words many years later as he was explaining why he did what he did. And I think you already see where this is going. He essentially decided that he was going to keep Bill Cosby from being able to invoke his Fifth Amendment right by promising that he would never be tried criminally, which would mean he would have to answer these questions in the deposition, and that would open him up to civil liability. So Andrea might not be able to get justice in a criminal courtroom, but maybe she could get some measure of justice in a civil courtroom. That was sort of his purpose. Now, weirdly, and as will become a problem later on, this agreement with Cosby was never reduced to writing, save for a public press release laying out that the Commonwealth would not be prosecuting Cosby. And once Cosby's civil lawyers learned of this non-prosecution decision, they realized they were pretty much screwed in this civil case. Cosby would either have to answer questions that put himself in civil jeopardy, or he would have to put himself in danger of being held in contempt.
Now, in November of 2006, Cosby settles the case the civil case after giving 4 days of deposition testimony about his affairs with young women over a span of 50 years. This included the use of quaaludes on women he wanted to have sex with. Now let's fast forward 2014. Oh, by the way, he settled the case for money. That's what you get in civil cases is damages. You don't get any prison time. And so he settles it for, I forget the amount right now, but quite a large amount, and there are no criminal charges brought. In October 2014, comedian Hannibal Buress calls Cosby a rapist in a stand-up act caught on video and shared online. After that video kind of goes viral, more women come out and accuse Cosby of assaulting them. It starts snowballing at this point. In December of 2014, the Associated Press petitions to have documents in Constand's 2005 lawsuit unsealed, and Cosby fights this request. Then the next year, July of 2015, United States District Court Judge Eduardo Robrino grants the AP's motion, saying, quote, "The stark contrast between Bill Cosby, the public moralist, and Bill Cosby, the subject of serious allegations concerning improper and perhaps criminal conduct, is a matter as to which the AP, and by extension the public, has a significant interest. The documents include deposition excerpts in which Cosby acknowledges giving a series of women pills and alcohol before sex."
Yeah, for those of you who think Cosby might be innocent of this, I mean, his deposition pretty much does him in. And it's interesting, as we said, Bill Cosby was this sort of America's dad, and later on in his career, he did become this kind of moralist, and he was very controversial, particularly in the African-American community, because of some of the things he said about the African-American community, of which obviously he's a part. And I think the Hannibal Buress stuff all sort of came from that, and then this judge is tapping into that. Like, you can't, on the one hand, you're out here publicly proclaiming all these things, and then you're trying to keep secret all this stuff that's important to the public. So he's gonna turn this over, and a firestorm was created. This is early in sort of the Me Too movement. It hadn't really got started yet. In fact, Cosby might have been the first of the people involved in that. And this is a firestorm, and all of a sudden people are asking, why is it that Cosby did all this and he's admitted to all this, and yet he has never been prosecuted? And by this time, there's a new sheriff in town. There's a new DA, Risa Furman, and she has taken over, and she wants to know, is there anything we can do to punish Bill Cosby? There's a 12-year statute of limitations on this, and it's a 2005 case, so we're in 2015. We've already had 10 years pass. We gotta get, if we're gonna do this, we gotta do it now. Now, interestingly, Castor, who is, as we said, was the DA who made this deal, he actually emails Furman when he learns that she's thinking about doing this, and says that he wants to remind her of what they had done to get Cosby to talk in the first place. And here's what he says, quote, "I intentionally and specifically bound the Commonwealth that there would be no state prosecution of Cosby in order to remove from him the ability to claim his Fifth Amendment protection against self-incrimination, thus forcing him to sit for a deposition under oath." And in fact, Furman was aware of this decision because she had been Castor's first assistant when this had been decided, and he had discussed it in detail with her. So she's sort of his right-hand woman when he's making this decision. She's the second most powerful person in the office. Nevertheless, she would later claim she didn't know anything about this agreement. She didn't know what he's talking about. She didn't remember an agreement.
And that's interesting because Castor says that he would have he doesn't specifically remember the conversation with Furman, but he says if she is his first assistant, he absolutely would have discussed such a high-profile decision with her. And
it's honestly kind of difficult to imagine that he didn't. I mean, she says she didn't know anything about it, but that is hard to believe.
Absolutely. And just because, like you mentioned earlier, I mean, going after Bill Cosby back in 2004 or 5, it's a big decision. Not going after him is also a big decision. I mean, this is, again, we've been talking about this all along. He is a household name. You will get a lot of media attention and probably criticism for a decision like this. December 30th, 2015, Cosby is arrested. He enters a not guilty plea and is released on $1 million of bail. Cosby then filed a writ of habeas corpus asking that the charges be dismissed based on the agreement that he had with Castor. The court denied this motion, finding that there was not a formal non-prosecution agreement, but rather just a simple exercise of prosecutorial discretion.
Shopify is a platform built for growth, whether you're just starting out or already running a thriving business. From managing inventory to creating a seamless checkout experience, Shopify is designed to handle it all. And it doesn't stop there. Shopify helps you sell everywhere your customers are, online or in person. It's the ultimate tool for turning big dreams into big wins. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/OPP.
If you're looking to streamline your audio advertising buys and maximize your revenue, look no further than Triton Digital's programmatic audio advertising exchange, A2X. The private exchange consists of only licensed broadcasters and top-tier internet radio publishers, assuring the quality inventory and brand safety you can trust. Visit www.tritondigital.com to learn more.
By the way, I want to note that it's important that this is basically the first argument Cosby brings up. This is not an argument that he kind of cooks up years later after his conviction. This is his first filing after he is arrested is, hey, habeas corpus means you don't have a right to be holding me. And he said, you don't have a right to hold me because I had this agreement with the former DA and thereby, this entire governing body. Now, in its decision, the trial court found no authority for the, quote, proposition that a prosecutor may unilaterally confer transactional immunity through a declaration as the sovereign. Rather, the court noted, such immunity can be conferred only upon strict compliance with Pennsylvania's immunity statute. The Attorney General or a district attorney may request an immunity order from any judge of a designated court, and that judge shall issue such an order when in the judgment of the Attorney General or district attorney, 1. The testimony or other information from a witness may be necessary to the public interest, and 2. A witness has refused or is likely to refuse to testify or provide other information on the basis of his privilege against self-incrimination.
And you can see in this case why this is important, right? Like Pennsylvania thought about this potential problem and said, hey, if you're going to do this, there's this whole structure you have to go through. You have to get an order from the court. Court's going to issue the order. Everybody will know about it. It's going to be in writing, and it'll be very clear for the whole future that you're doing this, right? And of course, that didn't happen here, and that's why you're having this issue.
Absolutely. I mean, he falls squarely into number 2, right? On the basis of privilege against self-incrimination. The court goes on to say permission from a court is a prerequisite to any offer of transactional immunity. Because D.A. Castor did not seek such permission and instead acted of his own volition, the trial court concluded that any purported immunity offer was defective and thus invalid. So, consequently, according to the trial court, the, quote, press release, signed or not, was legally insufficient to form the basis of an enforceable promise not to prosecute. The court further concluded that it was unreasonable for Cosby to have relied on an oral promise as he did. With his team of attorneys, and he had a lot of attorneys whom he was paying, he should have known to get the promise in writing. This is not so much to say that an oral promise would not have been valid, but that it's not conceivable that there was such a promise, as Cosby's attorneys would certainly have asked for a signed agreement. Now, Cosby attempted to appeal this decision at the time, but it was ruled to be an improper interlocutory appeal, which are disfavored. And an interlocutory appeal just means it's coming before the case is finished. So it's not the end of a conviction.
And we talked about this in the McDonald case. The exact same thing. McDonald was trying to bring that whole Speedy Trial Act claim, and the Fourth Circuit said, yeah, your Speedy Trial Act rights are violated, and the Supreme Court said, nope, you don't get to bring that now, go have your trial. And it was only after the trial that he could then bring the Speedy Trial Act issue, and it's the exact same thing here. Essentially, the courts are saying, nope, can't bring that yet, go have your trial. If you're acquitted, we won't even have to worry about this. We'll deal with it if you're convicted, which is where we ended up. So fast forward to 2017, June 5th, Cosby goes to trial. Now, interestingly, another thing we've talked about before, Rule 404B evidence, the prosecution submits a notice that it wants to introduce 404B evidence from other women who are going to allege that Cosby had sexually assaulted them in much the same manner as Andrea is saying she was assaulted, but those people we can't prosecute their case because it's beyond the statute of limitation. And the trial court actually kind of partially grants and partially denies this. They allow one of these people to testify. We have opening statements, and the prosecutor warns the jury that Cosby isn't the person that he has presented himself to the public to be for decades. And the defense counters by doing what the defense does in cases like this. They attack Andrea's credibility. The only other accuser permitted to testify is a Kelly Johnson. She describes an assault that she says took place in 1996 at a hotel bungalow in Los Angeles. Andrea testifies about the incident, about the pills, about what happened. She says, in my head, I was trying to get my hands to move or my legs to move, but I was frozen. I wanted it to stop. Now, she is cross-examined for hours. And as we said before, the defense does what you knew they were going to do. They use every one of those contradictions in her statements against her. They attack her for delay in reporting this. They attack her for continuing a relationship with Cosby, despite the fact she was undergoing these unwanted advances. So one thing jurors do hear in this trial is the testimony that Cosby gave under oath in those depositions about giving quaaludes to women he wanted to have sex with, and how he described touching Andrea's body during their sexual encounter. He says, I don't hear her say anything, and I don't feel her say anything, and so I continue, and I go into the area that is somewhere between permission and rejection. I am not stopped. Those are his words. So you can imagine, what the jury probably thought when they heard that. But despite this testimony, the jury ends up being hopelessly deadlocked, and the judge actually declares a mistrial, and we have to do this all over again.
And by the way, just the fact that this jury is hopelessly deadlocked and a mistrial is, oh my goodness, I mean, it feels worse than
at least if you lose, it's over.
The outcome you want. Right. It's not over. I mean, that I have yet to have a mistrial that would make me so exhausted and tired. Now, the fact that there was a mistrial actually goes back to Castor's decision where he said, we're not going to prosecute because it's going to be a really, really big uphill climb. And you can imagine testifying for both Andrea as well as the one victim, additional victim who was allowed to testify, Kelly Johnson. It's exhausting for them as well. It's emotional for them, their family, if they have children, if they have loved ones watching. I mean, there is a reason a prosecutor may take that into account as to whether to try a case. Prosecutors immediately announced that they will put him on trial a second time. So, January of 2018, Cosby performs in public for the first time since the scandal broke back in 2015, taking the stage for about an hour at a Philadelphia jazz club. That's bold. I mean, he's kind of been hiding out while the legal troubles were going on, but he's come back out and resurfaced. In March of 2018, Judge Stephen O'Neill agrees to let 5 additional accusers testify at the retrial. So we went from one other accuser to now 5 additional, so 6 people other than Andrea, giving prosecutors a chance to portray Cosby as a serial predator who drugged and molested women.
It's kind of an interesting thing to do, to change your mind after, we didn't have enough evidence the first time we had a mistrial, so I'm going to say I was wrong the first time in limiting you to 1, and I'll give you 6 this time. It's kind of strange thing to do.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not sure I understand the 1. Like, how do you pick the 1? Anyways, that might be that can be on our Get Vocal. Get on our Get Vocal and ask us that question. But when you're talking about one other testimony, now it can be damning testimony, but you're not kind of showing the serial pattern. Now we have 7 accusers essentially telling the same type of pattern for Cosby. Now the defense argues that, quote, ancient allegations would confuse, distract, and prejudice the jury. That's kind of the heart of the Federal Rule of Evidence 403 argument, why you don't allow other acts to come in. The judge obviously ruled against the defense here. The first witness testifies to a sexual assault from 1982. The trial court found that these witnesses were more probative than prejudicial because they refuted Cosby's defense that the contact was consensual. It allowed testimony about Cosby giving others quaaludes to preclude any mistake defense. April 3rd, the judge gives Cosby's legal defense a huge lift because you can imagine all those other victims is not looking great for Cosby. But the judge gives Cosby's legal defense a huge lift by saying they can call a witness, Marguerite Jackson, who says Andrea talked about framing a celebrity before she lodged sexual abuse allegations against Cosby in 2005. So this is attacking Constance's credibility and believability. The judge also helps the defense's case by ruling that jurors can hear how much Cosby ultimately paid Constance in the 2006 civil settlement. So this judge is kind of just letting everything in at this point.
Yeah.
Now, on April 26th, the jury convicts Cosby of 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault. So this time, a lot more information comes in. By the way, let me talk quickly about usually why you don't hear about the settlement of a civil lawsuit. It can go both ways, right? It can make conflicted jurors feel okay about letting someone off the hook criminally because they think, well, she got paid millions. It's not like she didn't get any justice. It would just give some jurors some, kind of like an out for not convicting him. Also, it's not supposed to be relevant. Civil statutes and criminal statutes are not supposed to interact. They're not mutually exclusive. You can get both.
Yeah, it's a pretty rare thing to allow that kind of information in. I'm kind of surprised. I don't know. I guess the defense decided it was helpful for the reason you said. She's already got money. Why are we here? But on the other hand, that kind of sizable settlement also sends a signal to the jury that what he did was really bad. In any event, he does get convicted, and he is sentenced to 3 to 10 years in state prison. He's declared a sexually violent predator, which means he has to register as a sex offender for the rest of his life. He appeals, which is to be expected, and the Intermediate Pennsylvania Appeals Court affirms the conviction unanimously, which I think is what most people expect to happen because that's what happens on appeals. But then the Pennsylvania Supreme Court does something that's maybe a little bit unexpected. They actually grant the writ of certiorari and allow this case to go to the Supreme Court. As we've told you before, Supreme Courts control their own docket. They can decide what they want to hear and what they don't want to hear. They could have just said, we're not even going to hear this case. Go spend your time in prison. We don't want to talk about this. But they said, no, there are some issues that we want to address in this case, and it's probably not surprising to you that the first one is whether or not that agreement that Cosby had was binding and precludes him being tried. And the second was the sort of last issues we talked about, the 403 and 404 issues about these additional accusers testifying at his trial. Now, while this appeal is going on and the Supreme Court is considering this, Cosby is actually denied parole after refusing to participate in sex offender programs, which, is another example of his hubris here and his inability to admit he ever did anything wrong. And he's long said that he would resist these programs because he is innocent, he didn't do anything wrong, and that means he has to serve 10 years in prison. So be it. And I would point to this for all of you out there who think that just because the person doesn't admit guilt when they could be paroled, that means they must be innocent because obviously they're just fighting for what's right and true and just. Bill Cosby's guilty. He would not do this to get out of jail. Probably right then. I mean, he could have been paroled in May of 2021, but he'd rather sit in prison for 7 more years than admit that what he did was wrong. But in the end, I guess the last laugh is Cosby's because on June 30th, we have the bombshell. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court throws out Cosby's conviction. So why did they do that? The first thing to note is all that 403 and 404 stuff we talked about, they don't even reach that. They say, we don't even have to decide that question because we are going to overturn this conviction based solely on Castor's statement that he had given Cosby this non-prosecution agreement. And look, Castor has been absolutely solid on this, that he was trying to do this. He was trying to give he was trying to give Cosby this immunity so that he could testify. What's interesting about this, though, if you actually read the decision, and we will post the decision so you can read it, is the court actually agrees with a lot of the trial court's factual findings. We talked about earlier, the agreement that the DA gave does not meet the statute. Like, he's saying he's giving it to him, but it's not actually a lawful immunity agreement because he didn't do the things that the statute requires. And the court also credited the trial court's testimony or decision that Castor's testimony regarding the legal relationship between him and Cosby was inconsistent. It is clear what Castor was trying to do, but it's sometimes he's doing this through a press release and through an oral agreement. And is he doing this as the sovereign, as he now says, or was this more of just I am not going to prosecute you, but this is not somehow binding, which makes sense because if it were binding, you would expect him to go through those legal hurdles that he needs to go through.
The Supreme Court concluded, quote, "We are bound by the trial court's by the way, I think it's weird when they say that they are bound by the trial court. But anyways, the trial court's determination that DA Castor's actions amounted only to a unilateral exercise of prosecutorial discretion. This characterization is consistent with the former district attorney's insistence at the habeas hearing that what occurred between him and Cosby was not an agreement, a contract, or any kind of quid pro quo exchange." That may sound like that is the end of the opinion, but no, they don't stop there. They then say, quote, "Thus, the question becomes whether and under what circumstances a prosecutor's exercise of his or her charging discretion binds future prosecutors' exercise of the same discretion." And that's where the Commonwealth lost. Because the court held, quote, "When a prosecutor makes an unconditional promise of non-prosecution, and when the defendant relies upon that guarantee to the detriment of his constitutional right not to testify, the principle of fundamental fairness that undergirds due process of law in our criminal justice system demands that the promise be enforced." They go on to say an entirely different situation arises when the decision not to prosecute is unconditional, is presented as absolute and final, or is announced in such a way that it induces the defendant to act in reliance thereupon. When a non-prosecution decision is conveyed in such a way, and when a defendant, having no indication to the contrary, detrimentally relies upon that decision, due process may warrant preclusion of the prosecution. The court noted that the cases supporting this conclusion, quote, "are legion." It's really based on a kind of deep-rooted sense of justice. Right? They're not, this is completely outside of the statute in Pennsylvania. They're saying, what is fair?
Right. And you get this, right? I mean, putting aside what Cosby did or did not do, you sort of understand the basic principle of the prosecutor shouldn't be able to trick you into waiving your right. So, he didn't go through the legal requirements he was supposed to go through. He didn't jump through the hoops. He didn't do all the things that he's supposed to do to have this transactional immunity. But what he can't do is, on the one hand, tell Cosby, "Oh yeah, you're going to have this immunity." On the other hand, not take any of those steps, and then 10 years later, a different prosecutor say, "Oops, sorry, nobody filed that paper with the court. So even though you thought you had this protection and that meant you waived your constitutional rights, sorry. You're just screwed. We're going to be able to use all that against you," right? I mean, that's essentially what the court is saying, and they sum up essentially this way. They say, "No court could have forced Cosby to testify in a deposition or at a trial as long as the potential for criminal charges remained. Here, however, when called for deposition, Cosby no longer faced criminal charges. When compelled to testify, Cosby no longer had a right to invoke his right to remain silent. Cosby was forced to sit for 4 depositions. that he did not and could not choose to remain silent is apparent from the record. And they go on to talk about this. So essentially, he felt like he was absolutely compelled. His lawyers didn't stop him. There was no way he could choose not to testify. In fact, if he did that, he was facing criminal sanctions for that. Now, what's interesting about this is you can sort of see how that works, right? And you might think, well, okay, so he shouldn't have been forced to testify. So maybe we can retry him, but we just can't use those statements. None of that can be used. We're gonna knock all that out, and we're only going to use the other evidence we have against Cosby. But that's not what the court said. The court concluded that only full enforcement of the agreement could comport with due process, and this is a big deal. So they're not just going to kick out sort of the fruit of this poisonous tree, right? Which is what people call it sometimes, where if, your search is invalid or what you're doing is invalid, whatever the quote unquote fruit you get from that, you can't use. They're not just going to do that. They're going to preclude prosecution altogether. They're going to give him essentially specific performance, is what you call it in contract law, where you have to do what the contract says. And they say he must be discharged. And any further prosecution on these particular charges must be barred. We do not dispute that this remedy is both severe and rare, but it is warranted here, indeed, compelled.
This is a big deal, Brett. I mean,
you almost never see this.
Almost never. And in fact, it kind of seems like they've just gutted the entire statutory provision to get immunity. But then they I don't see a limiting factor written in, but they say, this is severe and rare, and they say it's warranted here, which, by the way, is going to throw a lot of prosecutorial discretion and decisions into kind of haywire, is my guess.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you're a prosecutor, you better be careful. What it's going to do is it's probably going to hurt defendants down the line, because prosecutors are going to be more hesitant to give them deals, more hesitant to discuss things with them, more hesitant to limit prosecution because they don't want to tie their hands in this way. That is probably an unexpected consequence of this decision.
Right, absolutely. Because this is such a big decision, it's not surprising that it was not a unanimous decision. In fact, it was very closely split. It was essentially 4-3. 2 of the dissenting judges agreed that Cosby's conviction should be overturned, but they dissented as to the remedy. And they said that suppression of the evidence illegally gathered was sufficient. Like we were saying, that's typically the route you take. Just exclude the fruit of the poisonous tree, and that if there remained evidence of Cosby's guilt, he should have been retried. Now, finally, there was Justice Saylor, who dissented in its entirety. His opinion begins with a biting statement that effectively mocks the entire majority decision. He says, quote, I respectfully disagree with the majority's determination that the press release issued by former District Attorney Bruce Castor contained an unconditional promise that the Commonwealth would not prosecute appellant in perpetuity. Interestingly, though, Saylor indicated that he might have overturned the conviction on 403 or 404 reasons, which the majority did not reach. That's really interesting because I think the 403 and 404 issues are a lot more hairy and they're difficult to dive into. And in a way, the court just sidestepped the entire issue by saying it doesn't matter because of our majority decision.
One thing I want to say about this prosecution, I commend these guys. I commend these prosecutors for prosecuting this case and the way they did it, which may sound weird because they just got hammered. But I think they knew they had a guilty guy here with a lot of victims, and they were going to give it a shot. And they knew all these things were risky. They knew the 403 stuff was risky. They knew even prosecuting him was risky. And they knew that this was a possibility, that they would lose like this. But they did it anyway because they were seeking justice, and they rolled the dice. And I mean, they got a 4-3 decision, so they almost made it. But in the end, they did not, and it's as we've said, it's pretty much as devastating an opinion as you can get as a prosecutor, because not only did you lose, but you can't even go back and try it again, even though you won. You won at trial. You had a jury who said this guy's guilty. You have all this evidence that he's guilty, and yet you're looking at a situation where you can't actually do justice. for those people who are the victims. And the question a lot of people have asked is, can this go to the United States Supreme Court? The answer is almost certainly no. And that may seem strange to you, but the state Supreme Court, or in this case, the Commonwealth Supreme Court, is the final word on questions of state law. And even if there are federal questions that are part of the decision, if there is what they call an adequate and independent state ground on which the decision rests, the Supreme Court won't take it because they don't have jurisdiction to hear that question. So here, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court relied pretty heavily on the due process requirements of the Pennsylvania Constitution. And it's probably the case that even if the United States Constitution did not require this decision, the way the Pennsylvania Supreme Court wrote this opinion, and because it based it largely on the Pennsylvania Constitution, over which they have the final say, then this case probably can't go to the Supreme Court. And that's going to strike a lot of you as strange, I know, but that's America for you. I mean, we got 50 sovereign states in this country, and they actually are sovereign. I mean, it's not just for property tax purposes or whatever. Like, every state can have constitutions that are more protective than the United States Constitution. The United States Constitution is a floor. It is not a ceiling. So some states, California, for instance, very, very protective, far more protective of a lot of rights than the United States Constitution. And so when a decision is based on one of those things that's very much in the purview of the state, you can't just go to the Supreme Court and ask them to overturn it, because they can't.
So, in other words, this is it. His conviction is overturned. There will not be a new trial. This will not go any further. And Cosby knows this. I think he's just announced his comedy tour that's going on very soon. I think he's already selling tickets to it. Yeah, I mean, do you think the Pennsylvania Supreme Court got it right?
I mean, I think they did get it right in that it seems pretty clear that Castor, what he was doing in the message that he sent to Cosby was, you cannot assert your Fifth Amendment right because you are now immune from prosecution. And I don't think you can do that and then turn around later and prosecute somebody. I disagree completely with the remedy. I think the remedy is crazy. If that prosecution team has enough evidence, absent those statements that he made in the deposition to prosecute him, why shouldn't they get another chance? You know, I don't understand if there's evidence that's completely independent of those statements, that did not come from those statements and was not derived from those statements, why a jury should not get the opportunity to hear that evidence and decide whether or not it's sufficient to convict him. Now, is it? I don't know. And you got this 404 stuff, which might make it even more difficult if you can't use those past assaults. But I think they did get it right on this one narrow question about the immunity.
Yeah, and I think, this is an extreme case. I think the Supreme Court felt they could make this decision because of Castor's email laying out to the new DA what he thought the old agreement was. So there's no question about what he meant to do based on his own words. I think that was helpful for the Supreme Court, for the majority. And also, I think in particular, the fact that his civil attorneys, or there's testimony that he thought he faced he did face criminal sanctions or criminal repercussions if he refused the civil depositions, I think also had an effect on them. And I agree with you that I think they reached the right decision. But, oftentimes in very difficult cases, we joke that judges try to take the easy way out by finding another reason not to have to deal with the difficult case. I think the difficult case would have been parsing through the 403 and 404B decisions by the trial judge. I think, honestly, he let in a lot of things, and there's a lot to argue on both sides, and it is not a clear-cut decision whether he let in too much or didn't let in enough. I think the question is actually whether he let in too much. And I don't think the Supreme Court wanted to delve into it because likely they would have to leave it to the discretion of the trial court judge. So instead, they reached the outcome they wanted based on another reasoning. And oftentimes you'll see this with judges saying that that a plaintiff doesn't have standing, or there's some jurisdictional issue, these are threshold issues of who can bring a case rather than reaching the merits of the case. And I feel like that's what they've kind of done here, is rather than kind of reach the meaty issue, they dealt with it on other grounds.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think they kind of did. They kind of did take the easy way out a little bit. One point I want to make before we move on to Britney, spend a few moments on her. Alice and I, we do a lot of conversations with people about innocence. We've talked to Maggie, we've been on her show, we've talked about the law, and we've talked about the system and how the system works. And we often get people who want to talk about how we can reform the system. And there's people who really don't like the fact that it's so hard to overturn a conviction. And people who think it should be easier, and people who don't like the doctrine of finality, and people who think if there's any error in the trial court that, somebody should get a new trial. And I just want to note for people, there was this French philosopher in the 1800s called Frédéric Bastiat, who wrote a pamphlet called What is Seen and What is Not Seen. And I often think about that whenever I'm thinking about stuff like this. And his whole argument was when people are making public policy, they always think about the problem that's in front of them, and they always think about the benefits if they do something to address that problem, but they very rarely consider all the things they don't see. They don't consider the things that aren't right in front of them. And so I would just have everybody take a look at this case, because the fact of the matter is a person who sexually assaulted a lot of women is now free. And a lot of women who were victims will never get justice. And maybe that's the right decision under the law, but that's the cost. And there is a cost. And when you start talking about changing things and making it easier for people to have new trials or to have their convictions expunged, this is going to happen, and it's going to happen more. So I'm not saying don't support reform, but just know the cost. Know that there is a cost, and it's very real. And if this infuriated you and made you angry and made you not want this to be the case, just remember that it could be something that you see happen more if you change the rules of the game. And one more thing on this. A lot of people have said that the only reason Bill Cosby got off is because he had the money to afford lawyers, the best lawyers. And that's why this went down the way it did. A couple things on that. Number one, the argument of you told me you wouldn't prosecute me, so I had to talk, so I talked, and now you prosecuted me. Not exactly complicated. Doesn't require, top flight legal talent to make that argument. Any public defender, who are really good lawyers, by the way, this myth that public defenders aren't good lawyers is just not true. Any public defender would have made that argument. So that's the first thing. Second thing, however you change the system, however you make it easier for people to get out from under a conviction by a jury, the wealthy are always going to be able to take advantage of that. There's not going to be a system where having money and power is an advantage to you. And that's just one of those unfortunate facts of life. I think we need to worry more about how to get resources to people who need them than to try and change the system in some way that's only going to benefit people who aren't in that situation, because I don't think that's practical. Okay. Britney Spears. So on the same day that this happened, Britney Spears, her conservatorship, which a lot of people have been watching, a judge issued an order that she was not going to dissolve the conservatorship. Now, a lot of people have asked us about this, and we're going to keep this pretty short because there are two things that I think are important. Number one, this is a really complicated area of the law. It's not easy. If you want sort of an interesting look at this, I would recommend LA Not So Confidential. Did an episode on this. Both of those folks are psychiatrists, psychologists. I forget exactly what they are, but they work in this area in California, same jurisdiction. And so they have a very unique perspective on this. And in a lot of stuff, you'll learn a lot of stuff. But one thing I would caution people, this is complicated, and there's a lot we don't know. We just don't know what all is going on behind the scenes. We don't know what doctors are telling the judges. We don't know what's in the reports. We just don't know the situation. So before you think that this is something where the judge must be being bribed or there is some nefarious purpose behind this, we actually just don't know. We don't really know what's going on. And one of the things that I thought was interesting in that this conservatorship thing is something where there are going to be hearings about this often because the courts are essentially trying to ensure that the person's rights are protected. And Britney Spears did not actually ask to have her conservatorship dissolved officially. That wasn't really what this was about. She made a statement to the judge, and in that statement, she asked for it to be lifted, and she asked for it to be lifted without a independent evaluation of her. And I think that was probably the key here. They're never going to, it is very difficult to get a conservatorship. We all know, because it was very public, about some of the issues that Britney Spears dealt with 15 years ago when this was formed. And there were some involuntary psychiatric holds that were placed on her that led to this. Now, you may think her parents and people who were trying to make money off her took advantage of that to get this in place, but they got it in place. And once it's in place, dissolving it's going to be very difficult. And I think what's going to have to happen is there's going to have to be some independent evaluation of her done that essentially reaches the conclusion that she can function in society without the benefits, to the extent there are any, of this conservatorship.
And that's a really important point, Brett, that you make, that she didn't actually ask for a dissolving of the conservatorship. And courts can only, it may seem like judges, what you hear in the news, have all the power in the world, but they can only act upon a motion by one of the parties. They can't just act sua sponte. Something has to happen and for them to then be able to grant or deny it. And so even though her own testimony is not the right word, her her statement to the court mentioned it. Honestly, it was very windy. You should read it in its entirety, because I think it actually gives a little bit of insight into the need for an independent assessment of her ability to make the request. But again, she is making the statement based on her experience. She is not her own attorney making a motion.
And I think this is one of those things where it's just so easy. And I feel like the press does such a bad job and just does a disservice to folks. I mean, the way they write about this, they make it seem so obvious and so, clear cut that she clearly should be released from this. And this is so terrible. And in a weird way, Britney Spears was somebody who was objectified for really her whole life in different ways. And it's like she's being objectified again, but in this strange way where people have sort of poured whatever particular political issue is of interest to them into her. It's like, if you're a libertarian, this is an example of the state and how the state is too powerful, and this is or this is about women's rights, or this is about her right to control her own body because there's this testimony about whether or not she's being forced to have an IUD. IUD? Yeah.
IUD.
An IUD or not. That is what it's called, right?
Mm-hmm, yes. Intrauterine device, if you want to know.
And it's like nobody actually seems to care about what's actually best for her. And is what's actually best for her just to be completely free and independent? I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know how any of us can. And like I said, LA Not So Confidential, they do such a really good job on this. And at the end, not Dr. Shiloh, but the other guy, her co-host, talks about how he wants Britney to be happy and healthy. And that doesn't necessarily mean dissolve the conservatorship tomorrow. It existed for a reason in the beginning, whatever that reason is. And I just think everybody should pump the brakes on this case and let there be some independent, and it needs to be independent, because I think everybody agrees that some of the folks who are handling this, including her family, may not have her best interest at heart, but there needs to be some independent evaluation here and determine what's best for her. And I think that's what we should all hope for, is what's best for her. And I think at some point in the next year or so, you're probably going to see that happen. And I wish we could say more about this. I wish we could have a more fulsome discussion about this, but this is a very fact-intensive question, and we just don't have the facts. We do not know what kind of diagnoses Britney's under. We do not know what her actual mental issues are. We do not know the facts behind how her conservatorship is being handled. All we know is just sort of the things we hear, the things that she said in her statement, tea leaves that people gather from her Instagram account. There are so many things we don't know. And even if we think that she is being taken advantage of in some ways, and maybe she probably is, that doesn't mean we have enough information to make that kind of informed decision. This judge is very well respected, and I think she will do the right thing in the end. I know neither one of these cases came out the way people wanted them to, but I think to some extent, at least, both courts kind of got it right.
I think you're gonna get some hate on both of these. Not just you. I think we'll get some hate on both of these.
I mean, I love Britney Spears, and it is a weird situation because it's sort of it's a window into a part of the world that most people just don't know about. Competency, mental illness, mental competency. I mean, we deal with this in our cases, and it is hard. It is so hard. I hate these cases. I hate when it comes up because there is it's not black or white. It's not, physical health often is black or white, right? Like you either have a broken bone or you don't, you either have a gunshot wound or you don't, or you were stabbed or you weren't. But with mental illness and some of the problems people face, it's never that clear, ever. And whether or not someone is competent, whether it's to stand trial or to manage their own affairs without injuring themselves or, being taken advantage of, is just really hard. And I think that was the thing that struck me about it. And the only reason I bring this up is I just feel like so many people had a knee-jerk reaction. I even had a knee-jerk reaction. I was like, oh my goodness, you need to let that girl go, But when you actually think about it, it's like, I don't know, I just feel so bad for her because I feel like everything in her life since she was 16 years old has been under the microscope and in a way that is unusual even for celebrities don't deal with the stuff she's dealt with. And I don't know. It's an interesting issue. And hopefully, like I said, at the end of the day, hopefully whatever happens is what's best for her.
Yeah, I agree. And, we'll have this just be the teaser, and we promise you guys to get vocal, and we can talk more in detail about this because if you've watched the documentary, if you've read the news articles, I don't think it's the whole story, but there is a lot of interesting things there, and that's the problem. I don't think the media or any of us know the full story because typically with conservatorships, it is something deeply personal like mental state, there are reasons that HIPAA laws apply. Usually people's medical histories and tests are not splashed across the public domain. And I think that is the case here.
Yeah, I think that's right. Okay, well, Alice, do you have anything else you want to add before we sign off?
No, it's just really great to have your whole family back home, and it's great to be recording it again. It's been more than a week, I think, since we talked, and that's much too long for me.
Much too long. And these were interesting things. I mean, very sort of law heavy for those of you who like the law, but interesting questions. And like I said, not so bloody and depressing, though kind of depressing, frankly, as some of the cases we normally talk about. Well, we want to hear what you guys think. I'm sure you have tons of questions about this stuff. The great questions for a future Get Vocal. So please do send those to us, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod for all your social media. For those of you who are on Apple, do leave a review. You guys have been leaving a ton of great reviews. We love to read them. Take the time to do that. They're very helpful for us. They not only boost our spirits, but they also help us on the download front. So I hope you'll do that. I hope you'll also support our sponsors. And I hope if you want to be a member of our Patreon page, do join that. We have those Get Vocals every month where you can ask us anything you want. Well, so I think that's all we have for tonight, but we will be back next week with a very controversial case. So get ready. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. That's crazy.
Okay.
Alice. You need to
See,
find some work-life balance.
See, I actually share my life with you. You
Well, I haven't really had much to do at work lately because I'm
I'm
on
not
maternity
talking about
leave.
work. I'm talking about your life. No,
I mean, I don't know which day. It's just,
Are you sleeping 12 hours a night?
no.
Okay, exactly. You know, I didn't sleep more than 3-hour stretches for almost 6 months. It's been fun.
I really need my sleep.
I
Everybody
agree.
needs sleep. I'm not good at not sleeping.
Daily Harvest delivers delicious harvest bowls, flatbeds. Can you tell I've been hanging out with my child all day, looking at flatbed trucks? Okay.
Yeah.